Hello, and welcome back to Mammalian Anatomy at Keuka College. In this video, we're going to start our lecture series on chapters 19 and 20, where we're going to look at the anatomy of the heart and blood vessels. We're not going to focus so much on the physiology. We're going to save that for vertebrate physiology, and we're not going to have so much time to go through the individual names of the blood vessels. Rather, we're going to look at the cross sections of blood vessels and compare their histology. But in this video, we're going to start out with the anatomy of the heart. So let's hop right into it. The heart is an amazing organ. One of my favorite things about the heart is that the heart can actually generate its own heartbeat and beat completely on its own without being connected to nerves or blood vessels, hormones, or anything else. The heart can be put on a table and it will continue to beat on its own. It is so amazing. And it can do this because of a special grouping of cells called pacemaker cells that are found within the conduction system. We're going to learn about the conduction system in a later video. But for now, let's just focus on the anatomy. So the heart is a really amazing organ because it can beat on its own, but also for the fact that it can beat continuously. It starts beating in the womb and will continue to beat throughout a person's lifetime, and it will beat 100,000 times per day. So if we estimate the average lifespan of a person to be about 71 years, it will beat 2.6 billion times in a lifetime. How awesome is that? Just amazing. And it doesn't get tired and things like that. It's so wow. More so, it's the amount of blood that it can pump throughout the day. It will pump 8,000 liters of blood through the heart every single day. And imagine the body really only has 5 liters of blood on average, more or less depending on a person's body size. But it's that same 5 liters that is pumped over and over and over again to get to that 8,000 liters. How amazing. All right, so let's get into the anatomy. The heart also is cool because it's actually a double pump. So the heart's major function is to pump blood throughout the body, but rather than just being one pump and pumping through one circuit, it's going to pump through 2. So it is 2 pumps in one. And so the right side of the heart is going to pump through what is known as the pulmonary circuit, and the left side of the heart is going to pump through the systemic circuit. So let's look at them. So first and foremost, let's orient ourselves to this diagram. Over here we have the heart, and we can see the 2 circuits connected to it, the pulmonary circuit up here and the systemic circuit over here. What we have is this side in blue is going to represent the right side of the heart, and over here in red, we're going to see the left side of the heart. Remember, it's always going to be the patient's right and left. So this side is going to be the right side of the heart, and this side is going to be the left side of the heart. We're also going to have to deal with oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood. Oxygen-rich blood is going to be depicted in red, and oxygen-poor blood will be depicted in blue. So over here, what we're going to have is the pulmonary circuit. So let's kind of go through it together. The right side of the heart is going to pump oxygen-poor and carbon dioxide-rich blood into the pulmonary circuit, to the lungs. It's going to get rid of that carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a byproduct of making energy, in the mitochondria. And so we have to get rid of that excess waste. So we get rid of the carbon dioxide using our lungs. Again, for energy, we need to use oxygen to make ATP and make energy in the mitochondria. And so that oxygen needs to be picked up by the lungs and brought into the blood. So the pulmonary circuit is going to get rid of carbon dioxide and pick up oxygen and bring that blood back into the heart. And specifically, it's going to bring it back into the left side of the heart over here. So in a nutshell, the pulmonary circuit is going to start at the right side of the heart, travel to the lungs, and return back to the left side of the heart. Now let's look at the systemic system. The systemic system is going to get that oxygen-rich blood and carry that oxygen-rich blood to the systems of the body. And so when we're referring to systems, we're thinking of the skeletal system, skeletal muscle system, digestive tract, all those sorts of things. So we're delivering the oxygen to the cells of the body so the body can make energy. And when we do deliver that oxygen, we're going to pick up the carbon dioxide waste that is produced by the body and carry that carbon dioxide back to the heart, and it will carry it to the right side of the heart. So the systemic system in a nutshell will go from the left side of the heart to the systems of the body and back to the right side of the heart. Again, I always write things out if you need to review or pause. So if you want to read through it and take some notes, you can pause on this slide and kind of go through it in a little bit more detail or kind of review here. So I'll give you a moment to pause. Okay. Now let's look at the anatomy and specifically looking at the location of the heart within the body. So really what I would like you to know is what cavities the heart is going to be located in. So what cavities is the heart going to be located in? But you will see some additional information here. You don't need to go into this much detail for the exam. It's just more of an FYI sort of thing. So first and foremost, the heart is going to be located in the thoracic cavity, meaning that it's going to be encased by the ribs, the sternum, and the vertebrae. And it's going to be above the diaphragm. So it's going to be within the thoracic cavity. The heart is specifically posterior to the sternum. And if you wanted to get into really nitty-gritty detail, the top of the heart, or what we call it the base, because that's the wider portion of the heart, is going to be by the third costal cartilage. And the apex, the point of the heart, so over here, is going to be at the fifth intercostal space. But I'm not going to make you know that in that much detail. The heart is rotated a little bit to the left of the body. And so this means that the right atrium and the right ventricle are going to be more anterior, while the left side of the heart, so the left atrium and the left ventricle, are going to be more posterior. Also, the apex of the heart is going to be pointed more towards the left side of the body. This rotation and the pointing of the apex is important when we do EKGs, because you have to set up the electrodes to measure. You have to set up the electrodes in specific locations to measure the electrical activity for the heart properly. When we get into vertebrate fizz, what we'll do is we'll set us up on a 3-point EKG. So it won't go across the chest, but it will go on our wrist and ankles. And we'll be able to see our own heart's electrical activity. So that will be really, really cool. If we wanted to get more specific, yes, the heart is in the thoracic cavity, but more specifically, it's going to be in the mediastinum. The mediastinum is the cavity that is going to be located between the two lungs. And what will happen is that mediastinum will actually contain the thyroid gland, the thymus, the esophagus, the trachea, and it'll contain another cavity within it called the pericardial cavity. And the pericardial cavity will house the heart. Think of this as like the Russian nesting dolls of cavities. The biggest cavity is going to be the kind of thoracic cavity. Then it's going to be in the medius. Housed within the thoracic cavity, we have the mediastinum. And then housed within the pericardial cavity, the smallest doll, is the heart. So we have the thoracic cavity. Inside that, we have the mediastinum. Inside that, we have the pericardial cavity. And inside that, we have the heart. So it's cavityception. Cavity within a cavity within a cavity. So that's the location of the heart. With the pericardial cavity is going to be formed of a special membrane called the pericardium. So the heart is going to be housed in a membrane called the pericardium. This is a double-layer serous membrane, and that serous fluid is going to be important because that serous fluid is going to act as a lubricant. One of the first functions of the pericardium is to protect the heart. So it's going to connect to the heart, and it's going to encase it, and it's going to make sure that heart is safe and sound. Also, it's going to protect the heart by limiting friction. So the heart is going to have to expand and contract within the pericardial cavity. And so because it has to move within this pericardial cavity, it's going to, it had the possibility of experiencing a lot of friction as it's moving. However, the serous fluid creates a lubricant so that as the heart is moving, it slides back and forth, and so it doesn't really, it reduces the friction and reduces the risk of damage to the heart as the heart is beating. It also anchors the heart in place, and so the pericardium is going to anchor the heart to like the sternum and the vertebrae and the surrounding lungs. And it's going to hold it in place so it doesn't move around too much. And lastly, it prevents the heart from overfilling. We're not going to be talking about this very much in this class, but when we get to vertebrate phys, we'll be looking at how the heart can actually expand as blood fills it. And that expansion can actually cause the heart to increase its strength of contraction. But if it overshoots that stretch, it can lose its contractile strength. And so overfilling the heart is kind of a bad thing. The heart's contraction will be weaker if it's too full. So the pericardium kind of helps prevent that overfilling so the heart can contract as strongly as possible. Don't worry about that too much now. Just be aware we're going to talk about it more in the future when we get into vertebrate physiology. We'll get into all the nitty-grittiness later on. The pericardium is actually divided into two layers, the visceral pericardium and the parietal pericardium. So the visceral pericardium is going to be the serous membrane that's going to directly touch the heart, while the parietal pericardium is going to be a little further away, and it's going to come in contact with things such as the sternum, the vertebrae, and the lungs nearby. And there's going to be a little space in between. That space is going to be the pericardial sac, which the heart will expand and relax into. And that space is going to be filled with that serous fluid, which will act as lubrication. Let's look at a little bit of a bigger picture of these two layers. So over here, what we can see is we have the pericardium. There's two layers of the pericardium. There's one that's directly touching the heart. This is going to be called the visceral pericardium. And there's a second layer you can see being retracted away a little bit over here. This is going to be the parietal pericardium with a space in between called the pericardial sac. This area, the visceral and parietal pericardium are actually continuous with each other. It kind of comes over and loops around. So this image over here is trying to kind of show how the two layers of the pericardium are attached. Imagine punching into a balloon, and your fist is supposed to represent the heart, and the balloon is going to represent the pericardium. The part of the balloon that's touching your fist represents the visceral pericardium that's going to be directly attaching to the heart. The rest of the balloon that kind of loops over and around is the parietal pericardium. So any part of the pericardium that doesn't touch the heart is the parietal pericardium. It's still one continuous membrane. It's just differentiated by what area does it come in contact with. And there will be an air-filled space within the balloon in this example, and that would be like the pericardial sac or the pericardial cavity. This is actually pretty easy to see during dissection. If you're like dissecting a pig or a mink or even a person, if you cut shallow enough and remove the sternum and the ribs carefully, what will happen is the pericardium will will intact, and you'll see the parietal pericardium is going to actually veil the heart, and so it'll be difficult to see the heart directly because the parietal pericardium will be located over that. You'll actually have to cut open the parietal pericardium and pull it away to be able to see the heart. The visceral pericardium is directly attached to the heart and is part of the heart. So you'll actually see that during the dissection that the parietal pericardium and the visceral pericardium kind of loops around, and the visceral pericardium will be a part of the heart. Other interesting fact is I used to shadow autopsies as a part of my education. And one of the things that we do during autopsies is that we have to collect a blood sample for toxicology. So we are careful with the pericardium when we're opening it up because we would like to use the pericardium as a cut. So as the heart is cut out to be examined, the parietal pericardium will remain intact, and we will actually pool the blood into the parietal pericardium so that we can have a collection of blood to sample and send off to toxicology. So, interesting fact, a little bit gross, probably a little bit both. So, yeah. I'm going to try to post a dissection walkthrough of the heart so that you will be able to see the different layers. I'm going to try to find an image where you can actually see the parietal versus visceral pericardium. I'll post that on Moodle, so look for those images there. Going a little bit deeper into the heart, we're going to look at the different layers of the heart. The heart has three major layers: the epicardium, myocardium, and endocardium. And again, you can use the etymology to help you out learning them. The epicardium is going to be actually synonymous with the visceral pericardium, and it's going to be the outer layer of the heart over here. It's going to be a smooth surface that is going to create serous fluid, and it will create a nice shiny glossy texture to the outside of the heart if you're doing a dissection. The middle layer is going to be the myocardium. We can see the root word myo, meaning muscle. And so this is going to be the muscular layer of the heart. It's going to be composed of cardiac muscle tissue. And we'll get into the histology more later. But this area is going to be a thick layer of muscle. It almost looks like the texture of steak when you're dissecting it. I'm sorry, I don't usually try to relate things to food, but that is the best way to describe it, because they'll have like that fibrous texture to it. Over here, what we're going to have is we're going to have the endocardium. The endocardium is a simple squamous epithelium that is going to line the heart, and this endocardium is going to be continuous with the endothelium that is going to line the blood vessels. Within the heart, this will line the chambers and the valves of the heart, and it's going to play an important role in creating a smooth surface for blood to travel across, or not across, but against. And it will reduce the friction that blood will experience as it's traveling through the heart and as it's traveling through the blood vessels. Later on, when we get to vertebrate physiology, we'll see that reducing this friction is really important, because friction is associated with resistance, and resistance can actually increase blood pressure. So we'll learn all of those nitty-gritty details in the future, but for now, just know that the endocardium plays an important role in reducing the friction that blood experiences as it's traveling through the heart. So those are the 3 layers of the heart. Now that we've kind of got through the layers and the different membranes that surround the heart, let's cut into the heart and look at the different chambers, valves, and blood vessels that carry blood to and away from the heart. The first thing I'd like to focus on are the chambers. So let's look at them. The heart has 4 chambers. It has the right and left atrium and the right and left ventricles. Remember, right and left is going to be the patient's right and left and not your own, so that's why it looks flipped on the diagram. I would be very careful when you are taking your exams to be sure that you're labeling the right and left side correctly. You'll get half credit taken off if you label right and left incorrectly on your diagrams. So let's look at these chambers. This is going to be the right atrium, and this will be the left atrium. And atrium refers to entryway or a gathering place. Just like the first floor of our building has the tables where all the math students study, or where all students come in to get math tutoring, that would be an example of an atrium. It would be a gathering place where people come to collect and study. So over here, this would be an atrium for blood to collect. The right atrium is going to collect blood from the systemic circuit, and the left atrium is going to collect blood from the pulmonary circuit. Lower down here, we're going to have the right and left ventricles. I think of vents, so venting out. So these areas are going to pump blood out of the heart. The right ventricle is going to pump blood into the pulmonary circuit, while the left ventricle is going to pump blood into the systemic circuit. I want you to take a moment to notice that there are structural differences between the right and the left ventricle. So take a moment and tell me, kind of pretend, what those differences that you see. The major difference is the thickness of the right and left ventricle. And let's talk about the differences between the right and left ventricle and why these differences occur. So the right ventricle is going to be much thinner over here, and it's going to have a thinner myocardium, and it's going to have a thinner wall, and as a result it's not going to be able to produce as much pressure when it contracts. On the other hand, the left ventricle is going to have a wall that is at least 3 times as thick. It has 3 times as much myocardium. And not only that, the cells that form the myocardium, the kind of, I guess, a fascicle-like structure, it would actually form a figure 8 pattern. And so rather than just squeezing in like a circle, it'll actually twist a little bit and kind of almost like a wringing motion, like when you're taking a towel and you're wringing out the water in the towel. It creates that twisting motion. This allows for the left ventricle to create a lot more pressure. It's about 4 to 6 times greater than the right ventricle. And more blood will be able to be pushed out better that way. Why do you think the left ventricle has to be stronger and produce more pressure than the right ventricle? I'll give you a moment to think about it. Yep. So the right ventricle only has to pump through the pulmonary circuit, while the left ventricle has to pump through the entire systemic circuit. Because of the increased length of the blood vessels, that actually creates a lot more resistance. And so what will happen is more pressure will need to be generated to pump blood through the entire length of the systemic circuit compared to the shorter length of the pulmonary circuit. So we're going to need to have a much stronger ventricle to get through that systemic circuit. More on that in the future. Love physiology. In addition to having chambers, the heart is going to have valves. Valves are going to play a really important role in preventing the backflow of blood. We want blood to travel through the heart and also through the circulatory system in a single direction. So these valves are going to play an important role in controlling the direction of blood flow. We have 2 categories of valves. We have the atrioventricular valves and the semilunar valves. As the name atrioventricular suggests, those valves are going to be between the atrium and the ventricles. And the semilunar gets its name because semilunar, it has almost a moon shape to it. So we'll see when we look at the diagram, they'll have that moon shape. There are going to be 2 atrioventricular valves, the tricuspid and bicuspid. There are other names associated with these valves, like mitral valve, but I like using tricuspid and bicuspid because of the etymology of it relates to its anatomy. Tricuspid means 3 points, and we'll see that the tricuspid will actually have 3 flaps to it, and the bicuspid has 2 points, so it'll have 2 flaps to it. Semilunar valves, on the other hand, are going to prevent backflow from the major vessels, such as the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, and prevent that blood from going back into the ventricles. The ventricles spent a lot of work and energy pumping that blood out of the heart, so the semilunar valves are going to ensure that it doesn't come back into the heart. Let's talk about them and see them on the diagram. So over here and here we have the tricuspid and the bicuspid. The tricuspid would have 3 flaps. Here it's cut, so we only see 2. And the bicuspid would have 2 flaps. Here we only see 1 because the heart has been cut. And the tricuspid and bicuspid valves look like sails on a boat. And these sails will be the flaps that we're talking about. And they'll be tied down with a special type of string called the chordae tendineae. So whenever you're talking about your heartstrings and or pulling on your heartstrings, you're specifically referring to your chordae tendineae. And they'll be kind of attached to this papillary muscle and kind of be held down. And the tricuspid and the bicuspid will kind of act like sails. Rather than being filled with wind, they'll be filled with blood, and this is what causes these valves to close. Here we have the pulmonary semilunar valve right here. That's semilunar, meaning it's moon-shaped. It almost has a cup-like shape. This one is called the pulmonary semilunar valve because it goes to the pulmonary trunk. And hidden underneath here would be the aortic semilunar valve, which would go to the aorta, but it would have a similar shape to this pulmonary semilunar valve. Here we're looking at the valves almost from a top view. Here we have the aortic semilunar valves, the tricuspid with its 3 flaps, and the bicuspid with its 2 flaps. And we have the aortic semilunar valve and the pulmonary semilunar valve. Here we can see that the tricuspid and the bicuspid are open, and so this would allow blood to enter the ventricles. When the ventricles contract, what would happen is these valves would fill like sails with wind, but rather than wind, they're filling with blood, and this would actually cause the valves to close and prevent blood from going back into the atria. Rather, what's going to happen is the semilunar valves are going to open, and it's going to allow the blood to enter the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. When we don't want the blood going backwards from the aorta and the pulmonary trunk back into the ventricles, what will happen is the cups of the semilunar valves will fill with blood and therefore close and push against each other, preventing that backflow. So, it is cool. Another cool thing about these valves, when they close, they create a heart sounds, the bum 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 or kum 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 kum. In physiology, we call it lub dub, lub dub, lub dub, and so it'll create those heart sounds. The last kind of thing that I'd like to go over in this video is to look at the major vessels that carry blood to and away from the heart. So let's look at them on the diagram. Okay. So over here, what we're going to have is we're going to have the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. The superior and inferior vena cavas are going to be the largest veins of our body. And veins are going to be vessels that carry blood back to the heart. And so here, the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava are going to carry blood from the systemic circuit into the right atrium. Over here, we're going to have an artery. This is going to be the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries. Arteries are responsible for carrying blood away from the heart. So this would actually carry blood from the right ventricle to the lungs, where it will become oxygenated. This over here, we have the pulmonary veins. Pulmonary veins are going to carry blood back to the heart, and specifically to the left atrium. And lastly, we have the aorta. The aorta is going to be the largest artery of our body. It's going to carry blood from the left ventricle all the way to the systemic circuit, and it's going to come up and loop around the back of the heart and travel behind the heart down to almost where our hip bones are. So it is a very large vessel based on diameter and length. So those are the major vessels of the heart. A few things that I want to address here when we're talking about arteries and veins. Arteries, as I said before, are going to carry blood away from the heart, and veins are going to carry blood to the heart. Many times students think that the red and blue that are on the diagrams refer specifically to identifying arteries and veins. That is not the case, though for the systemic system, a lot of them will match up. That's not always the case. We can already see here that this pulmonary trunk and pulmonary arteries are blue, and the pulmonary veins over here are red. Red and blue in anatomy books actually refers to the presence of deoxygenated versus oxygenated blood. Blue refers to deoxygenated, red refers to oxygenated. And this is just a distinction made in textbooks. Be aware that there is no blue blood other than us. There's one weird little crab that has blue blood, and that is something different. But for mammals, there's only red blood. That red color comes from a compound called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin has a red pigment to it, and it will only be red. It can either be a brick red when it's deoxygenated, or it can be a bright cherry red when it's oxygenated. The reason why our veins and arteries look blue under our skin is because our skin is really good at absorbing red light. So as light shines into our skin, what will happen is it'll get reflected off of our blood vessels, and the red light will be absorbed by our skin, and the blue light will shine through. So this is why we see our arteries and our veins as a blue underneath our skin. Yes, no, maybe so. All right. So that is our video about the anatomy of the heart. I will see you in the next video where we'll talk about cardiac muscle histology. I'll see you guys later, and be good to yourselves. Bye-bye.